So, kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar for the proposed district plan changes. My name is Kate McRae. I'm Head of Communications and Engagement at Council. Look, thank you very much for taking part in this event. Webinars are a bit of a new engagement tool for us, not only because of COVID, but also because we want to offer residents more ways to engage with us, and hopefully we can connect with more people from different parts of the city and peninsula. Because this is a new forum for our team, please be with us if there are a few bumps in the session. So a bit of an agenda for this evening. Tonight we're going to take you through the proposed coastal hazards plan change, but first I'd like to introduce the team behind the scene and let you know how you can participate even though your mics and cameras are turned off. Then I'll hand over to the planners who'll explain the proposed changes and why they're happening. So tonight you're going to hear from Mark Rushworth, who's our subject matter expert. We also have Planning Manager Mike Stevenson on the call, Coastal Adaptation Program Manager Jane Morgan, and Derek Todd, who's our Principal Coastal and Hazard Scientist from Jacobs, to help any questions. Behind the scenes, running our Q&A, and to keep everything running smoothly, we have Ike, Kieran, Emily and Emily. So thank you very much for the questions that you've supplied during registration. We'll provide answers to those as part of this presentation. So while your mics and cameras are switched off to keep the session moving, you can still use the Microsoft Apps app using the Q&A function at the top there. We'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A and you should see them answered, your questions answered in the Q&A sidebar on the right. We'll also be taking some question breaks throughout the presentation, so if you're busy listening, you don't need to worry that you need to try type at the same time. We will be pausing at times to ask questions. Now, unfortunately, Q&A is only available if you've downloaded the app, but if you're not on the app, you can email through there to planchange@ccc.govt.nz. And we also tonight have Slido. We've got Slido. If you go to Slido, and just one moment please, I need the details. Details there. If you go to slido.com and enter the code 434439, you'll pop on through to our presentation and you can ask your questions there. If you're on the app, you can also react, thumbs up, thumbs down, some of the questions and answers in the chat section, and you can also the reactions tab at the top of your screen to respond to what's being said during the presentation. If you're having any trouble hearing or if you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. You can just click those three small dots above more at the top of your screen and turn on live captions, which is near the bottom of the drop-down box. One last thing from me before we get things underway. I hope you'll have seen there that the banner has come up to let you know that this session is being recorded. This will be made available to you and shared on our website in the next couple of days. So I'll now hand over to Mark to start the presentation.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background and context about coastal hazards and the plan change, and then we'll move on into looking at the plan change itself shortly. So coastal hazards, for the purposes of the draft plan change, we're considering 4 coastal hazards. That's coastal flooding or inundation, coastal erosion, rising groundwater and tsunami. And with almost 400 kilometres of coastline and significant areas of low-lying land behind that, there are parts of the district that are already exposed to these hazards. In addition to that, though, we're also expecting to witness sea level rise. And the Ministry for the Environment guidance, based on the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, is that we'll see 30 centimetres of sea level rise within the next 30 years and 1 metre within the next 100 years. And the issue with that is it's going to put more people in harm's way, and Christchurch is already exposed to more coastal hazards than either Auckland or Wellington. We go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the legislative context, legislation establishes a number of statutory drivers that requires us to manage significant risks from natural hazards, and these include coastal hazards. The Resource Management Act establishes that risks from natural hazard are a matter of national importance and requires these to be addressed in district plans, and the plans must also consider the effects of climate change. The New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement requires us to identify coastal hazards and avoid increasing risk of social, environmental and economic harm. Next slide, please. So for the district plan, we've previously looked at including provisions on coastal hazards, and that was as part of the district plan review back in 2015. But following various submissions at the time and a review of that, there was an order in council that the government directed that we withdraw the provisions at that time, and that they should be dealt with through a separate process and as soon as practicable. So at the moment, there's currently a gap in the district plan. It doesn't cover the full extent of potential hazards or manage the full range of activities that could be exposed to them. So an example of that will be in Banks Peninsula. The plan really just deals with subdivision as one of the matters affected by coastal hazards, not land use. The concern here is that without adequate control, there's a risk that development could occur without appropriate ways of managing the risk of coastal hazards. And this is increased when we've got a strong property market as we have at the present time. Next slide, please. So in order to understand the nature of coastal hazards, we've undertaken various studies, and there are two main technical studies that are underpinning our work at the moment. The Coastal Hazard Assessment was updated in 2021 and provides us with the latest data on coastal hazards. It considers a range of possible scenarios so that we have a good understanding of the potential range of impacts from coastal hazards. And this information is underpinning the Council's wider coastal hazard programme. In addition to the coastal hazard assessment, we've undertaken further analysis to understand the risks from coastal hazard and how this data can be used to inform the district plan. And the Jacob study that was undertaken last year allows us to identify the most appropriate scenarios to use for planning purposes and enables us to put lines on the planning maps. Both of these studies have been publicly made available, and they're on our website for you to look at should you want to dive into the technical detail. We can go to the next slide, please. So the Jacobs report started to look at the question of risk associated with coastal hazards. Risk is a combination of the likelihood of an event happening and the consequence or impact of that it has. So in the example on the screen, we've looked at a flooding scenario. The likelihood of event taking place is represented by the modelling of sea level rise, and the consequence is represented by the depth of flooding. So while there is more certainty that 60 centimetres of sea level rise will occur within the next 100 years, the consequence of a less likely 1.2 metre sea level rise is greater, both in terms of the area that will be affected and the depths of the floodwater. We've also considered whether the speed of floodwater would be a factor, but in our floodplains, the velocities are usually relatively low, typically below 0.5 metre per second, and international research shows that these speeds are considered to have negligible effect in terms of risk. So if we go to the next slide. Based on this information, we went out last year to engage with the first round of community consultation on the coastal hazards plan change. And between October and December, we consulted on an issues and options paper. This set out the background in relation to coastal hazards and considered the ways we could approach a plan change to address the risks. This is the first of 3 stages of consultation on the plan change, and we're now moving into that second stage where we're looking at the draft provisions. The issues and options paper identify 4 main options that range from doing minimum to avoiding new development across all parts of the district affected by coastal hazards. We received a range of feedback, including comments about the process, the impact of regulation, and the technical reports, both the coastal hazard assessment and the risk-based coastal hazards analysis. From the responses we received, those who responded to the question about which of those options they preferred, option 1, the risk-based approach, was the most supported one. In addition to getting the written responses to the issues and options paper, we had 12 submitters who made deputations to Council's Coastal Hazard Working Group, and Council received a full summary of the submissions that we received. From this feedback, we've been able to help shape the thinking about how to develop the draft plan change, and that's what we'll come on to look at next. Next slide, which I think is just a pause for any questions that we may have at this point.
So as we said, we'd have a couple of these slides throughout the presentation to enable you to ask any questions. Just a reminder of how you can do that, emailing it through to Plan Change. If you don't have the app, if you do have the app, you've got the Q&A function at the top there, and you'll see under in the Q&A, we've also populated with some of the questions that were asked as part of the registration process. And we've also got Slido, and just the information for that one more time, slido.com, and the code to get in is 434439. That number again, 434439. So we're just going to wait just a couple of moments here, just as we've got a few questions coming in, and then we'll get things underway again. Rightio, let's carry on.
Okay, so moving on now to the draft plan change that we've put out for consultation. The plan change deals with proposals for new development, subdivision or land use within areas of potential coastal hazard. It's developed the risk-based approach and seeks to enable forms of development where risks are low, with increasing control and restriction as the level of risk increases. There are a number of new objectives, policies, rules and mapping that shows the extent of the areas that are affected and the ways in which we are looking to manage those activities in those areas. The main focus of the plan change is around inundation or flooding and erosion. We have considered groundwater and tsunami risks, but these are not being mapped separately, as the areas that are affected by those are broadly similar to the areas that are affected by the coastal flooding. Therefore, we're proposing to deal with groundwater and tsunami just as an assessment criteria within those inundation areas. We're also giving consideration to whether we can remove any of the existing provisions from the district plan, so we can help to simplify the structure and make it easier to operate. So we'll be looking at areas of the flood management area, the high flood hazard management area, and residential unit overlays, and see if the new provisions can provide a better way of managing development than those existing ones. Go to the next slide, please. So just taking through those aspects in a bit more detail, the new provisions would sit within the natural hazards chapter of the district plan. So that would then allow us to consider across a wide range of zones that could be impacted. The objective reflects the direction in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement of not increasing risk, but it also recognises the need to take a balanced approach with the existing communities, and this is responding to feedback we received through the issues and options stage. There are 7 new policies, and these set out certain matters that will be managed through the various rules and provisions in the plan. The risk-based approach develops a more responsive way of dealing with development and risk, and it's considered to be a more refined approach than a one-size-fits-all, which could be one of the other options that would be available. It establishes 4 different risk categories, and these range from very low, low, through to medium and high, and the approach we're taking in broad terms is to look at enabling development where risks are low and can be more readily managed, and gradually increasing the levels of control and restriction as risks increase to ensure that we can manage the effects adequately. Next slide, please. So this slide is just really providing a bit of context in terms of what the Resource Management Act allows us to provide for in terms of different classes of activity. And these establish whether a resource consent is needed, and if it is, what the matters will be that will be considered when making a decision. So this is on a scale from permitted activities, where you don't need a resource consent, right through to prohibited activities. And just to explain what that means, a permitted activity, you don't need a resource consent, but you may need to meet certain standards that are set out in the plan. Controlled activities need a resource consent, but it will be granted. That can be subject to conditions just to make sure that the effects are appropriately managed. Restricted discretionary activities require a resource consent, but only those matters that are identified in the plan can be considered. So it limits the scope of what you're looking at through that consenting process, and consent can be approved with conditions, or it may be declined. Discretionary activities also require a consent. Applications can be approved with conditions again or declined, and there is scope to consider a wider range of issues. The non-complying activities again require resource consent. Applications can be approved only if they meet the plan's objectives and policies, or if the adverse effects will be minor. So the tests change as you work through this process. And finally, prohibited activities, you can't apply for a consent or grant a consent for those. However, we're not proposing to use those as part of this process. So next slide, please. Part of the reason I just wanted to take you through the activity status is because the table that you're looking at now provides a summary of the activity rules. It tells you what you can do as of right and where resource consent will be required and the different status that that would have. The risk-based approach proposes to enable activities where risks are low and can be easily managed, so they will be permitted or controlled, and steps up the level of control to provide more oversight and management as the risks increase. So that will be the restricted and full discretionary, and the greatest level of control and restriction is retained just for where the risks are at their highest level and most difficult to manage, and those would be the non-complying activities. The approach that has been developed responds both to the different areas of defined risk and the activities that are more vulnerable and sensitive to hazards, and this makes it more responsive to circumstances. So as you can see, looking across the table, where you're looking in the very low column on the left-hand side of the table, it is largely enabled activity. As you progress through the low, medium, and then up to high, you'll see the colours moving through the yellow into the orange and red colours where there is more restriction. We've also been able through this process to look at different types of activities and deal with those appropriately in terms of their sensitivity to risk. So hazard sensitive activities, for instance, are not as enabled as those that are less so. And for example, a hazard sensitive activity could be a residential care home or an education facility where you've got a lot of people that may not be best equipped to respond to an emergency situation. Just to finish off on that, there are within the plan change, various areas of control and matters of discretion that have been identified, and I mentioned earlier that the plan, where it's a restricted discretionary activity or even a controlled activity, can only deal with certain matters. So the plan sets out what those are, so it's very clear in advance the types of things that will be considered where a consent is needed. Just moving on now to looking at the mapping. The risk areas have been mapped across the district in those areas of coastal hazard. The map shows the risk areas in different colours, and it covers both flooding and erosion risk. This example on the screen is looking at flooding. The maps have been made available on our web viewer, and you're able to go in and search for individual properties or look around and see the overall lie of the land. It's probably worth pointing out at this stage, it is very much a draft plan change. It's still a work in progress, and the mapping in particular is something that we're still looking to refine. If you zoom in closely, you can see that it's quite pixelated around the edges, and we're looking at how we can get a more refined version for the final notified stage of the plan change. So that will come about, but we would be more than happy to receive any feedback to help us shape things as we go. The other thing to note is that the risks have been mapped according to where they lie. So that means that within one property, there may be more than one risk category. And that then helps to inform property owners which parts of the property are exposed to higher levels of risk, and look at opportunities to try to locate development in areas that have lower risk. Okay, I think that covers off that, and we're on to the next little break for some questions. So Katie, back to you.
A couple of prompt questions on the slide there that just reflect what we're asking as part of the consultation, but obviously open to any questions. And we have had a couple come through on Slido, and I realised that everyone might not have that downloaded. So I'm just wondering if we could verbally answer during this question period. We had one on tsunamis, and if I could just get one of the team to respond to that. And it was just, don't understand why tsunami is included, like earthquakes, they're unpredictable. Could someone respond, please?
Yes, tsunamis are identified as something that we need to consider in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So we've had a look at that. The way we're intending to deal with it, say, is not to try to map out in detail the areas of tsunami risk, but just identify through the assessment criteria matters that could be considered, so that we can make sure that we future-proof any developments so that they will be resilient, and recognizing that yes, all hazards are to a degree unpredictable, but it's better to be forewarned and forearmed about these rather than ignoring them altogether.
So we also have another question there around in the table of activities, which relates to the activity of a second dwelling.
Thank you, Katie. The activity table, that would be covered by B, a building not otherwise included in the table, but certainly we welcome feedback on that and any additions to the table you think are appropriate.
And we've also got one here said about the mapping. Quite furious that my property is low risk and the one next door is very low. How was this done, and how can we get this changed?
I'll answer that. The mapping is done based on the ground levels and the water depth. So that difference between low and very low means that the property has crossed that boundary between the criteria that was set between low and very low. So they may be not greatly different, but because they've crossed that that criteria threshold, then they're produced as different levels of risk. And the water depths have come from the modelling that has been done to produce depth of water in each of the scenarios that are used.
Thanks very much, Derek. And also within that table, if the property is low risk, can it still be able to be used to build up to 3 houses and subdivide?
So that's a good question, and we have a number of the next slides are just going to come on and touch on that. So I'll try and cover that off in a bit more detail as we get to that.
we might just kick on with the presentation.
Cool. Okay, so a very timely question that just came up there about the intensification issues. So there are a number of related work streams that are happening at the moment, and we just wanted to really flag that up and make you aware of that and the relationships that exist with coastal hazards. So there's a relationship between the intensification work that is happening through Draft Plan Change 14, Housing Business Choice, and the Draft Plan Change 12 on coastal hazards. The government's directed that we make provision for increased intensification across many parts of the city, and that we need to notify changes to the district plan to enable this by August this year. However, it also allows for what are called qualifying matters, and these can limit the amount of intensification where necessary. And this includes areas of potential natural hazard, and coastal hazards are part of that category. Coastal Hazard Plan Change will provide technical work that helps define where the coastal hazards are and where a qualifying matter can apply, and it'll assess the extent to which development can be enabled. And going back to look at the table that we had up before, I talked about the different categories of activity. So some categories will be enabled, generally the green, and then we moved into the more controlled and restricted types of development. So depending on the level of risk, we expect that some development could take place within coastal hazard areas, but not necessarily to the full extent that is being proposed through the national legislation on medium density residential standards. So the other point really to flag up at this stage is what we have looked to do is to make sure that we are bringing forward for the community a number of plan changes that have those relationships at the same time. So people will be able to look across that broad suite of proposals, see the relationships, and if there is a need to make adjustments in one area, then we have the opportunity to make sure that follows through to the other parts of the proposals. It probably is worth noting that the Plan Change 14 is largely driven by direction from government, so we don't have as much choice and flexibility around all the things that we can do there. There are further presentations on that coming up, and they'll go into more detail on that. But what we wanted to do is make sure that we put all of the information out to the community so you can see the full range of things and recognise that coastal hazards, whilst they're an important issue in their own right, do have a relationship with other matters such as intensification. So if we move to the next slide. One of the other key relationships in terms of work streams is with the Coastal Hazard Adaptation Programme, and we have, as part of our wider Coastal Hazard Programme, really developed two main streams of work. The Plan Change, which deals with managing new development and is more regulatory focused, and the Adaptation Programme, which deals with existing communities and looks at finding ways that we can live with the changes that are occurring in our environment. The Council approved a coastal adaptation framework in April this year, and we'll be starting a programme of adaptation planning with coastal communities later on in the year, and that's going to begin over in the Whakaropo Littleton Harbour area. The coastal adaptation framework really sets out the approach that we're taking to that adaptation planning, and then the individual plans will look at those areas in more detail and come up with the appropriate responses for those locations. And the other thing to flag up is that we're expecting to get new legislation in the form of the Climate Adaptation Act sometime next year, and government is currently working through various other matters in terms of climate change plans and policy. So it's a changing environment, and one that we're looking to keep abreast of and incorporate those new developments into the work as it progresses. We move on to the next slide. So getting towards the end of the presentation now, really the this slide is just to flag up the some of the key steps that are coming up. We've got the consultation on the draft plan change running through for another 2 weeks until the 13th of May. We are continuing to refine the technical work. As I mentioned earlier, this is still a work in progress. It is draft, and we are looking to get feedback from the community to help us shape the final version of the plan change. We'll then, once we've got that feedback, have a good look at it, see how we can make any necessary amendments to the plan change, and that will be reported back to the council in August. We will be making recommendations then around a formal plan change for notification, and at that point there will be another opportunity for engagement and submissions to be made, and that will go through a formal RMA process. Worth noting that the plan change, the notified plan change, will be accompanied by Section 32 evaluation of the costs and benefits. So there will be a whole raft of other information supporting the plan change that explains how we've reached decisions along the way. And on the right-hand side, the steps that are outlined there takes us through the various stages. Once we've notified the plan change, the submission process, opportunities for further submissions. There will be an independent hearings panel that will consider those submissions, and that will then report back to the council with recommendations, and council will then have a decision to make on adopting the plan change, and there will be opportunity for appeals at that stage. And that's when we're expecting the coastal hazard plan change to become operative. Okay, next slide. So there's a lot of information to take in around this subject. This presentation tonight is really just to give you an overview, providing the background and some detail on what we're looking at through the plan change. We've made a lot of information available through the council's website, and this list is some of the key places that you might want to go to find some further information. I believe we'll be able to email out these links following tonight's event. It's all available currently on our website. If you have a look at the Have Your Say and the plan change pages on the council's website, you'll find all these documents available, and you can dive into that in as much detail as you want to do, and hopefully that will help you understand a little bit more about coastal hazards and what's involved in the plan change, and give you some more information should you wish to make a submission. And then I think we're moving on to the further chance for any final questions, I think.
So we have had a couple of questions come up that I'd like the team to answer now, if we could, please. And just a reminder about how we're taking questions tonight. So you can use the Q&A function at the top if you have the Teams app downloaded. You can email us at planchange at ccc.govt.nz, or you can use slido.com, and that code for that again is 434439. But we've had a question here: will the risk category maps, i.e. the very low to high, be dynamic? feedback and a follow-up to that. In other words, will property owners and developers be able to submit site-specific topographical surveys following development where site levels may change, or simply to correct council records to ensure a property's classification is accurate? This is critical given that other parties such as insurers, banks, solicitors, etc. may rely heavily on data in making decisions involving the risk profile of the property. So just that question again, will the risk category map be dynamic?
I can answer that. We're looking at methods of how the district plan could be more responsive to new information that emerges in the future. Changes to the district plan, however, are subject to a statutory process under the Resource Management Act, which we must follow, and this limits the ability for changes without notification to affected landowners and the opportunity for submissions to be made and a hearing thereafter. Notwithstanding this, we would continue to update the plan as new information emerges, and in between changes there would be a pathway to enable assessment of proposals where there's updated technical information, and that would be on a case-by-case basis through consenting.
And I have another one here about what level of hazard would prohibit intensification?
I'll answer that. Prohibited activity status in the context of the Resource Management Act precludes someone from even applying for resource consent. Council has proposed as the most restrictive activity status non-complying, which is still restrictive. This is used for activities that are generally not anticipated, but it still enables someone to apply and for an assessment to demonstrate that there's not an increased risk of harm. We'd need to carefully consider and have a strong evidence base to use prohibited activity status, which would may preclude reasonable use of the land.
And one here for Mark Rushworth maybe. When the final plan is decided, when will it come into effect? Is it immediately or in several years' time? What's that time frame again, please?
Okay, so at the moment we're proposing that it would have legal effect once the final decisions have been made by council. So that's likely to be, well, it will be after hearings, likely to be over 12 months away. But we are keeping that under review in light of the new legislation that's coming through around intensification. So because some of the provisions for that make intensification provision have legal effect immediately once it's notified. So we're just trying to make sure that we get the right advice in terms of timeframes around that. But the current proposal is saying that we would follow a normal RMA process, that we would notify, go through submissions and hearings, and only when the decision is made it would have legal effect.
Just see if there's any further questions coming in, and while we do wait, just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our website in the next couple of days. We'll also be doing a full transcript of the questions and answers that have been asked as part of the registration process, as part of the Q&A, as part of Slido, and as part of the emails that we've received. So if you have asked a question and we haven't been able to answer it tonight, we will be answering it post the meeting and make all of that information available to all attendees. Was I on mute that entire time?
I could hear you, Katie.
Just checking, did you hear that question? Are there any changes planned relating to commercial development in the coastal hazard area?
So just trying to think how best to answer that one. The activities that would be controlled are not specific to particular zones. It looks at whether it's different types of building or land use that we're looking to control. So there could be restrictions if it is to do with some of those. They're set out in the table, but there are also provisions that are coming through, say in the other plan changes, in particular plan change 14, housing business choice, that do look at commercial areas. So it would be a case of having a look at both of those plan changes to understand the detail.
Just checking we've got any final questions. Finally, before we might wrap things up. So just to say again, we will be making all of this available online. There will be a transcript of all the questions and answers. If we hadn't got to your question and answer, then it will be part of the transcript. And you can, of course, continue to send through questions to us as part of this. Click on to the next slide. So just a reminder about the engagement consultation process. We are seeking feedback until the 13th of May and would welcome your feedback. And final slide, please. So if you have any feedback on the webinar, how it's gone for you tonight, we'd love to hear it, and you can email that through to us at engagement@ccc.govt.nz. Any issues about the content, any questions you might have about the Coastal Hazards Plan change, the plan change at ccc.govt.nz is the email address for that, or you can give us a call on that phone number there. We also have another couple of webinars that you might be interested to attend next week, and that's on residential intensification and commercial intensification. So look, thank you again for coming along this evening and giving up your time in your evening for this presentation. Really appreciate having you here and for the questions that you've asked. We'll be in touch with you with a link to the webinar once it's up on the website. So thank you again from myself and the team. Good night.